Thank you all for coming. First, I'll also give a shout out to Duquesne University, even though I'm from the School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. My son is a proud graduate of Duquesne University, and he got a great education and had a wonderful time. So thumbs up to Duquesne. But welcome to the sort of health studies session for this particular meeting. This shale gas and public health conference has been going on for many years now, and we usually have a series of speakers that talk about some of the current health studies, and then we'll sort of finish this session with a panel discussion entertaining some of the questions that you have raised while you've been listening to the talks, as well as in general what health studies mean to this particular activity. So I would like to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Mary Willis. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology at Boston University School of Public Health. Her expertise lies in the combination of environmental epidemiology, spatial exposure assessment, and applied data science. She describes her work as econometric-based causal inference methods, which I think in techno-speak probably translates to how epidemiological studies can best be designed to inform health protective policy decisions. She works on how exposures from energy sector, which is oil and gas development, as well as traffic-related pollution, other aspects of the built environment, influence primarily reproductive health outcomes. She is the PI on an NIH Early Independence Award, which is quite an honor to receive, that examines how oil and gas development may impact human fertility and pregnancy. Mary?
Hello. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jim. It's one of the most enthusiastic ones I've ever had. So this is one of my favorite audiences, so I welcome all the tough questions. Today I'm going to present to you some of our early epidemiologic results related to oil and gas development in a prospective preconception cohort study. This is all federally funded research, so we have run into some issues recently. However, we've got a lot of cool things to share with you, for sure. I'll go through a brief background on oil and gas development. I know all of you know most of this, but just in case we have some new people on the line, I'll talk about how we evaluate it as an environmental exposure and how we brought it into this preconception cohort study. And then I'll give you some thoughts on future directions. So, okay, there's a slight lag here. So if I start talking about a slide and you don't see it yet, it'll be there in a second, I promise you. So here is the extent of oil and gas development in the United States. I'm sure many of you have seen this map a million times. One thing that I always think about here is that a lot of our research today, especially the epidemiological research, has been restricted to single states. So we have the Pennsylvania studies, we have the Ohio studies, we have the Texas studies, the California studies, which is really great for generating local evidence, right? Sometimes policymakers really want that Pennsylvania-specific evidence in order to affect change. However, when we're thinking about a lot of these epidemiologic concerns, we may be heavily benefited by thinking about how we can combine across state lines. And in total, right, about 18 million Americans reside within 1.6 kilometers of active oil and gas development. 5% of a population in any given area might not be enough to do a lot of things. However, when we start combining in data sources that can actually look at, say, California, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio all at once, we might be able to gain some better evidence. All of you here know really what oil and gas development is, but just for those of you who don't, it's really just a complex set of industrial processes to extract oil and gas resources from the ground. I won't belabor this too much. That is interesting. That is not the slide I'm seeing on my screen. Ah, that explains it. Okay. Can we switch to this share or no? Cool. So I will flip. This explains a lot. Let me see. Joop, let me. Cool. So Okay, we're gonna be changing this up slightly on the fly. It'll be fine. Cool, so here's just some of the aerial views of oil and gas development, right? We're thinking about some of these areas, there's just so much of it going on. And here's just one of the underground models that we've looked at, showing just the sheer volume of surface area being taken up by this industry. And when we think about this industry, right, we really have to think about it as as something that has multidimensional community impacts, as many of our opening speakers alluded to. Right, we have this economic component where we have cycles of boom and bust economies, which can have all sorts of long-term effects for local communities. You've got the haves and the have-nots, right? Some people are monetarily benefiting, while others are certainly not benefiting in the same regard. There's also demographic changes, right? With these big economic booms comes new people into the community, which can really change up community social structures and power hierarchies, that sort of thing. And then where I've spent most of my career is really focusing on this environmental component, thinking through how there's a lot of different pieces here that could affect environmental, or create environmental hazards. You've got air pollution from the site itself and the increased traffic from this industry. You have water contamination from potentially going through the water tables and pumping chemicals into the ground. And then you've also got persistent light and noise, which is less well studied in most locations, but still an important component here. And the argument that I've been making is that depending on which combination of exposures a given community receives, it may affect population health in different ways, which may explain how some of these studies don't necessarily perfectly align across locations. And so what I've been doing is we are working on the first prospective cohort study of oil and gas development and population health. Most of the studies today have been using administrative data, right? Things that are routinely collected, like birth certificate records, electronic health records. Those studies are awesome. I've worked on many of them as well. But you're highly limited in what you can actually think about. When we move into this prospective cohort framework, we can ask our participants whatever we want, right? And we were able to nest this project within an ongoing internet-based preconception cohort study. So we recruit couples who are trying to get pregnant, so people with uteruses aged 21 to 45 years old, who are residents of the United States or Canada and attempting spontaneous conception. So these are people trying to get pregnant without fertility treatment. We have, to date, over 22,000 female participants and about 4,500 of their male partners. So this is the largest preconception cohort study ever conducted, and it really enables us to look at outcomes that are impossible to look at in, say, an administrative data source like a birth record. Here's the basic study design of Presto, just to bring you guys all onto the same page. Our participants are remarkable people. When they enroll, they fill out a baseline questionnaire that takes about an hour at providing information on pretty much anything you can think of. We have reproductive history, we have what was your parents' highest level of education? We have their own income. We have their residential history over time to some degree. We know a lot about these people, and they are remarkably willing to give us all of this information. We have a really low missing data rate in this group. Once they have enrolled, we follow up every 8 weeks to see if they have gotten pregnant, as this is generally a preconception cohort study. By doing this, following them up until they get pregnant, we can calculate incident infertility, which is something that's really hard to do in the general population. Once they report a pregnancy, they move immediately to this early pregnancy questionnaire, another detailed questionnaire where they can tell us about any changes in their experiences or any changes in like their income, that sort of thing. They immediately proceed to when they hit 32 weeks, more or less, they have a late pregnancy questionnaire. And the really nice thing about the late pregnancy questionnaire is we can get incident spontaneous abortion, so miscarriages, which is again an outcome that's nearly impossible to examine in just a general population sample. Once the participants give birth, if they progress that far, we follow them up with a postpartum survey and get birth registry linkages and a lot of information on different birth-related characteristics and pregnancy complications. My team has spent the last 2.5 years developing time-varying spatial data integration measures for oil and gas development exposures across all of this. So for our participants, at any given time point when they're in the study, we can estimate more or less their residential proximity to oil and gas development and some characteristics about what's going on nearby. And so our objective here, you've probably figured out by now, was to launch a prospective cohort study of oil and gas development and reproductive health nested in this Presto cohort. It's a really efficient use of resources, so we were able to convince NIH to fund this because it costs way less for us to just tack on to an existing study than to start a new cohort from scratch. And so part one of our research has been developing a spatial data integration. So we needed to really figure out how can you measure oil and gas development in a consistent way across state and country lines, right? We have Canadian participants in this study. It's about 15% of our sample. We thought it would be really valuable to include them here. And so we had to go through all sorts of things, provincial records, state records, figure out, hey, what counts as an oil and gas site in Texas the same as how it would count in British Columbia? The answer we came to is more or less. So it's really well done spatially. We have pretty good idea of where everything's located, and we have pretty good temporal data as well now. We've also launched a risk perception survey to figure out to what extent are participants worried about this industry. So it's called the Environmental Distress Scale, and we've had about 1,000 participants fill out this survey since we launched it 6 months ago. Then we also are launching what you guys are probably most interested in, a personal air pollution and water contamination campaign. So a subset of our participants will be able to wear wristbands to get exactly what air pollutants they're exposed to, as well as collect tap water samples to see if there's anything unusual going on there. I have to tell you, we have not gotten to launch this part of the project yet. We just got our approvals through, so I don't have any wonderful results for you today. We just wanted to let you know this is what is in the pipeline for us. And then from here, we are conducting an epidemiologic assessment using this amazing outcome data from Pregnancy Study Online. While some of these outcomes have been examined before, remember, these are mostly in administrative data sources, which don't quite have as great of validity as we do from collecting these straight from participants. So we're able to examine for the first time fertility and fecundity and early pregnancy loss with respect to oil and gas development, as well as reinforce some of the existing literature on pregnancy complications and birth outcomes to figure out if there's sources of confounding, bias, any sort of issues in those administrative studies that we can deal with in our prospective cohort design. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the spatial data integration, what we've been able to accomplish, and some of our really early results. So as I noted, we have participants across the US and Canada. We published some of this about a year ago, about a year ago. Among participants who are within 50 kilometers of oil and gas development, you can see the distribution of exposure here. We have a lot of people in Texas, California, Ohio, lots of places with a reasonable amount of oil and gas exposures, which means we're able to do quite a bit of work here, which was really exciting to see, and really makes it that we can do some of these really nice cross-state comparisons and cross-province comparisons. So our exposure assessment here, we leveraged the EDF's oil and gas infrastructure mapping database called OGIM. There's a link there if you want to look at it. It's aimed to map every oil and gas site in the world. It's an ongoing project, of course. And we augmented it just to include additional temporal data on, say, what's going on, when was a site spudded versus going into production, that sort of thing. So we're going to publicly post this once we have our last data checks completed. Really, we're figuring out that we can look at all of these different state databases and just combine them in a more effective way, thanks to EDF putting in a ton of work. When we're looking at our exposures here, we really look at it in two ways. First, distance to the nearest site. This is an imperfect measure for exposure itself, but when you're thinking about the main regulations that are being proposed, zoning policy is what comes to mind a lot of the time, putting oil and gas development further away from homes. And so distance to nearest site, while imperfect for understanding exact exposures, is a really helpful measure in some contexts. Then we also do what's called an inverse distance weighted site count. The specifics of it aren't super important, but really what we're doing is we're taking into account that more sites near your home probably matters more than fewer sites further away. And we have a manuscript under review all about the different ways to assess exposure to oil and gas development and figuring out exactly what data sources make the most sense for a given question. And so one of the beauties of PESTO, right, is this remarkable outcome data. We have internet-based survey responses with validated instruments. We have published on perceived stress and depressive symptoms, which I'll talk to you a little bit about in a moment. And then we also have really interesting preliminary results on a range of exposures a range of outcomes that haven't been examined much to date. Specifically, postpartum depression has never been examined, as well as gestational diabetes. And there's only one publication to date on hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. And the other piece here that's worth keeping in mind, I think the two analyses that are going to be most helpful here are time to pregnancy, so incident infertility and pregnancy loss, but we haven't started those yet. But I will show you preliminary results from these ones highlighted in blue, and then I'll show you the published results on those ones that were highlighted in red. So this cohort is really unusual, right? It's a cohort of people who self-identify as pregnancy planners. That means it's not necessarily directly representative of the general population, but we can still gain a lot of valid insights. The mean age in this cohort is about 30 years old, but only about 17 to 18% identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. This, in the world of preconception cohorts, is a very diverse cohort. However, in the scheme of the actual US population, it's not very. Our mean pregnancy attempt time is about 2 months, so we're getting them really soon after they discontinue birth control. And this cohort in general is highly educated and relatively high income. So keep that in mind when I'm showing you the results on the next slides. And also worth keeping in mind, this cohort does not have many current smokers, and most of them see a doctor relatively often. So they're very high healthcare seeking and relatively high socioeconomic status, which may not represent directly every community that's exposed to this industry. So our results that we were really excited about that came out about 6 months ago is we looked at residential proximity to oil and gas development and mental health, right? We're really worried that preconception mental health may be one of the reasons that other studies have seen adverse birth outcomes, adverse pregnancy outcomes. And what we found first was in the adjusted prevalence ratio for the lowest versus highest tertiles of exposure, so using that inverse distance weighted measure, was about a 9% increase in high perceived stress, which is something going on there for sure. And when we look at it out in a distance form, you can see that the effect is concentrated within 2 kilometers of drilling. So this group who lives really close to this industry we're seeing has at least higher perceived stress levels, which was pretty interesting. But the result that has really had me thinking a lot in the last 6 months about how we approach this industry are these depressive symptoms results. We see about a 36% increase in the prevalence of high depressive symptoms when you compare the highest and lowest tertiles. And you can see this effect estimate goes out about 8 kilometers, right? Really showing that there's a much broader group of people affected by this industry, if these were proven to be causal, than would be necessarily thought of by just a basic zoning regulation, right? The furthest zoning regulations that have been put out are roughly 3 kilometers at most, right? We're seeing things out to 8 kilometers, which shows this broader question going on here. We're really excited for the risk perceptions results to see what we figure out there. Then the next slides are just some ultra preliminary results. Please do not cite them, but I really wanted to show you guys what else we've been finding. And each picture on the side is the student who's been leading this analysis with me. So Fintan Mooney, a PhD student at Columbia, has been showing that within 5 kilometers of oil and gas development, there was about a 53% increase in preeclampsia. These again are kind of preliminary results. We haven't adjusted or dealt with everything we needed to here. We also found some inconsistent but elevated evidence of higher gestational diabetes within 5 kilometers. And keeping in mind, we're doing just 5 kilometers for the sake of having these be consistent for you guys here. Then we also have looked at the small vulnerable newborn measure. You probably haven't heard of it, it's not widely used yet, but it's a composite measure of low birth weight preterm birth and small for gestational age to really deal with the fact that there's often infants who are small and preterm, that sort of thing. And while we don't have super strong effect estimates here, we do see in the same direction as all of those administrative studies that you've been reading for years, that there is an increased risk of small vulnerable newborns within 5 kilometers of oil and gas. And then finally, Kaylin Verkeljan, who's a new PhD student in my lab, has been showing that there's higher rates of postpartum depression symptoms within 2.5 kilometers of oil and gas development. I'm very curious about this particular effect once we start getting into it in more depth. But I really just wanted to show you guys today the different ways we've been thinking about this particular exposure outcome relationship here in this really unusual prospective preconception cohort study framework. So, we've seen to date, right, oil and gas development has been associated with worse preconception and pregnancy outcomes among this cohort of pregnancy planners in North America. But right, these results are probably the tip of the iceberg. Many of you are working on studies to dive into different pieces of this. We have ongoing work and grants under review at NIH to better understand exposure mechanisms, community perspectives, and just the full spectrum of population health outcomes. While these reproductive health outcomes are super interesting and very important, it's unclear to me, at least, what are the most effective outcomes to use to affect change. And with that, here's a bunch of our funding sources and our wide team here. And if you have questions for me that you want to ask later, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So just a point of interest is we'll be saving the questions even for the individual speakers for the end when we have our panel discussion. And so then just as a suggestion, as you are writing your questions either on the index card or online, for one of the speakers in particular, then just sort of note that on the top of the card or whatever as you're posing the question. If it's a question that is of more general interest that the whole panel can sort of participate in, then indicate that too. And that may help save some time at the end.